Okay, so we're going to get started on our application, and in the first few videos I realized that a lot of you are probably going to know a lot of this stuff because I'm going to talk about the basics. We're just going to create React app set up. So just bear with me. I do want to just explain this stuff for people that are newer to React. Now the first thing we want to do is generate basically a boilerplate of a React application that includes the library. It includes the initial files and folders to run just a simple boilerplate application. And one of the easiest ways to do that is with create React app. And this is just the React docs, and this is the page for creating a new React application. Now I'm going to go down here, so we can either install create React app with npm, we can install it globally on our system and then run it, or we can just use the npx command, which will simply run create React app without installing it on our system. So that's what we're going to do. Now I'm going to create a new folder for our project. I'm going to put it on my desktop, but you can put it anywhere. And I'm going to call it Pro Shop. And I'm going to open it with VS Code. So on a Mac, I can just drag it down to my VS Code icon. On Windows, you can just right click and say Open with Code. Now I have an empty folder here. I'm going to open up my integrated terminal with Control tilde. You can toggle it. And you don't have to use this. If you want to use your standard Mac or Windows or Linux terminal, you can. But from here, I'm going to say npx create-react-app, and I want to generate my React application into a folder called front end, because that's what this is. It's the client. It's the front end, the UI part of our application. Later on, when we start to deal with Node and Express and dealing with our database, that's all going to go in a folder called backend, and we're going to get to that in a little bit. Okay, so now create React app is done running, and it created inside our front end folder here all the initial React files and folders that we need. So I'm going to actually cd into that front end folder, and from here I'm going to run npm start, and that's going to run our front end dev server, or our React dev server. And all this is going to display is a simple landing page. It might look a little different depending on when you're watching this. Sometimes they change it up a little bit, but it should be something like this. Now, while that's running, I just want to take a look at some of these files and folders. So if we look in the package.json here, this has all of our dependencies that we're using, including React itself, React DOM, which is the library that's used for React to work with the document object model in the browser. React scripts includes the dev server that we're running and some other stuff. Down here we have our npm scripts, such as start, which we just ran. So we ran npm start, which starts up your dev server on localhost 3000 by default. We have build, so if we run npm build, or I'm sorry, npm run build, it's going to build out all of our static assets for deployment. So we'll be doing this much later when we're ready to deploy. We can also run tests. You can see that there's a testing library, but we're not going to deal with that in this course. And eject if you want to eject from create React app and customize your webpack and stuff like that. So let's go into public and into index.html, and I just want to kind of explain a little bit how React works and what it's doing under the hood. I know that a lot of you guys already know this, but just for the ones that don't, React is what's called a single page application framework. It's used to create single page applications, and what I mean by that is the browser initially reads this single index.html, and if you notice, in this HTML, there's not much. There's just this div with the ID of root. Now, if we go into the source folder, index.js is the entry point here where it brings in React. It brings in React DOM. Now, React DOM has a method called render where it takes our main app component, which is in app.js. We're importing it right here, and it puts it into whatever we put here, which in this case is the element with the ID of root. Okay, so this is just vanilla JavaScript document.get element by ID, and it's selecting this div with the ID of root. I could change this to something else like app, but I would have to change this as well. So it's just replacing that element with our main app component. Now every custom component that we create, we're going to put into that app.js, that main app component, and it could be directly, it could be through routes, but everything's going to go in there, and then that replaces that div in that single page in that HTML. So in a nutshell, that's how React works. There's more to it, but I just wanted to kind of give you the gist of it. I like to just do a little custom and cleanup before we get started. So in this index HTML. We're not going to do much. I just want to get rid of these comments here because we don't need these. And then for the title, this title will be displayed all over the application regardless of the screen that we're on or the route that we're on. Later on in the course, we're going to use something called React Helmet to have custom page titles. But for now, let's just change this to something more descriptive. We'll just say welcome to ProShop. And you can change this as well, the meta description. We'll just say find the best products for the cheapest prices. You can put whatever you'd like. We'll save that. Now this is also bringing in a favicon, which is right here in the public folder. It's this React logo. I have a custom favicon that I'm going to bring in, and I'll add that to the project files for this section. You can also find it in the main GitHub repository. And it's just a little shop icon. With those changes, if we go back to the browser and we reload or refresh, you'll see that we get welcome to ProShop, and we also have the little favicon. Now in the source folder, there's some files that we're not going to need. This logo, which is the big React spinning logo, we don't need that. We don't need setup test, app.test, and then there's 2 CSS files. I'm going to keep index and get rid of the app CSS. So these 4 files we can just scrap. And as soon as I do that, the server is going to, it's going to tell us that it's looking for logo SVG, but we just deleted it. And that's coming from app.js. So let's go into app.js, and you can import images, SVG, you can import CSS directly. Now, I just deleted both of these, so we don't want to import them. And this is our main app component, okay? And we're using functional components. You can also have class-based components, but these days it's much more common to use functional components with hooks. Now, in this return here, this is everything that's going to be output, and this is everything we just saw on that little landing page, the logo and all that. And this is JSX, and it's very similar to HTML. There's a couple differences though. You can't use class as an attribute. You have to use class name. And again, I know most of you probably know this. And then also you can have JavaScript directly in JSX. You just have to have these curly braces, or I should say JavaScript expressions. So you can have a variable, you can have a conditional, a ternary. You could say if logo, then something else display something else. Now I'm going to get rid of everything within this div. And it's important to know that when you return your output here, everything has to be wrapped in a single element. It doesn't have to be a div, it can be anything, but it has to be a single element. You can't go down here and put in a div or an H1 or something like that. The return has to be one element, but you can have whatever you want in that one element. Now in this case, we don't even need a div, so we can use an empty element, which is called a fragment. And then I'm just going to put in here an H1 for now and just say welcome to ProShop. And I'll go ahead and save that, and our server should fix because now we're not trying to import stuff that isn't there. I also want to get rid of everything that's in the index CSS and save that. And now if we go back to our browser here, we should just see welcome to ProShop. As far as our functional components, because that's what we're using, you can use this syntax just like regular function, although I prefer to use arrow functions, so I'm going to change this to an arrow function like that, and that should give us the same result. Now I would highly recommend that you use Git to use version control so that you can track your progress. If you don't have Git installed, you can go to git-scm.com, or you can install it with Homebrew on a Mac or your package manager on Linux. But what I'm going to do is actually I'll just stop the server for now. So I'll do a Control-C here. And if I do an ls-a, so this will list all the folder contents, even the hidden files and folders. And notice there's a .git folder already here. I want to get rid of that. I don't want that Git repository. So to do that, we can do rm-rf.git, and that will delete it. Because I don't want my Git repository in the front end, I want it in the root of our project. Now there's also this git ignore file, which you can see right here, that's in our front end folder. I'm going to move this into the root. So we'll go ahead and click move, and now this should be in the root like that. And what git ignore does is it allows you to describe any files or folders that you don't want pushed to your repository. For instance, you don't want your node modules folder pushed because that gets created when you just run npm install. Now I'm actually going to go ahead and just say node modules and then node underscore modules slash, because we're going to have a node modules in our root, which will be all of our server dependencies, and then we also have one in the front end. So any node modules folder should not be included. Another thing I want to add down here is .env, because later on we're going to have this .env file, which will be all of our environment variables, so our global variables, and we don't want to push that because that can contain sensitive information like our PayPal API key, our MongoDB URI. That's stuff you don't want in your repository. All right, so we'll close that. Now let's initialize Git, but we want to do it in the root. So I'm going to cd ... out of the front end, and from here we'll say git init. So that initializes our repository. I'm going to add everything to the staging area. So git add dot means add everything, and you can do git status and see what is actually in your staging area. So everything except for what we have in the git ignore. And then let's go ahead and say git commit, and then just add the -m flag because we just want to put a short comment here and say I'm just going to say React setup. All right, so that'll get pushed to our local repository. I would suggest making commits along the way. I'm going to try to do it after every video. You don't have to do that. You can do it whenever you'd like, but again, I would suggest using Git. And then towards the end, when we deploy to Heroku, we actually use Git to do that as well. So I'm going to cd back into front end here and run my npm start. Okay, so we should be all set to move on. In the next video, we're going to create the header, which is going to have the nav bar. We'll create the footer component and do a couple other things as well.